Hey everybody, look at this crazy setup. Today we're going to talk about experiments with coffee. This is what's basically a solution. What I like to do is, I'm a chemist, so I'm very particular about how I make my coffee. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is, if you want to do an experiment with coffee, your job is to play with the three main variables of coffee making. The first one is, really the beans, but I imagine at home you probably have, if you have coffee, please ask your folks, don't take the good stuff, or it's okay to use old coffee or something. I'm just saying that as a coffee drinker. Or you can use the good stuff. This is hard coffee from Portland. Yeah, it's from Colombia. It's called La Morelia. I always like to think about who I do. Now, so the first thing is the beans, but that's probably going to be the same. When you make an experiment, what's really important is to change one of the variables only, so then you can really study it. So to make a good cup of coffee, the best way to do it is with a balance. Probably at home you don't have a balance, so if you're going to make an experiment, use a scoop that has the very same, we'll use it the same way. I'm measuring out 20 grams of coffee. Okay, so this is an interesting place where you can start. I lost a bean, come back. No, it's really satisfying when you add one bean into, that's pretty, oh, come on, it's so hard not to be perfect. Oh no. There's 199.9, hey, thank you, Scale, all right, good. So what's really important, some of the variables you can play around with the coffee, the most important things are the grain size, because depending on the size of the particle, if it's a really large particle, it takes longer for water to get in there. Smaller particles, shorter. So really it's the grain size and also the time that water is inside, that this is in water. So if you put a big grain size in a water and give it only a little bit of time, it only can extract a little bit. Or it'll over extract the stuff on the outside and not get to the stuff on the inside. If it's really small, the water is going to come in and then extract it and then continue pulling out things. And a coffee bean has all sorts of cool stuff in there. This is me grinding. If you have a grinder, electric grinder, that's fine. Just try to grind it the same way. There's lots of different choices. If you look, you see I don't know if you can see that, but there's kind of like a coarse grind. That's what I've been doing these days. This is a video you get to watch me grind coffee. Hopefully it smells wonderful. The third variable is temperature, and that's probably the most, I think temperature and time are the most important two variables for coffee. So if you're going to make a cup of coffee, play around with those two variables. I set out on doing a bunch of these experiments to see if a bunch of these like really particular hipster ways of brewing coffee are actually accurate, and the science checks out. You know, I kind of wish that it didn't, so that I could be like smug. Okay, so you have, to make a cup of coffee, a couple general things. I like using a scale because it's the most accurate way to measure liquids. If not, you can use your cups or even a measuring cup. Okay, so whatever you have available. And just know that 1 gram of water is 1 milliliter. So if you're going to, I imagine you probably have a drip device at home, all right, something like this. And you put your coffee filter, and if you want, you can look online to see a bunch of different methods. This is a V60, it's from Hario. It's one of my favorite ways of brewing coffee. You put the grind in there. Oh, smells wonderful. Okay, so I have a few different suggestions for you. First thing is water temperature. So what I did was I boiled water. I have a kettle that has very specific temperatures, or you let it boil and then you let it sit for a minute, and that's at the perfect temperature. It's around 190. If you're lucky at home, ask around and see if you have a thermometer. You can actually test it, which is really great. Whatever you decide to change, try to keep everything else the same. So I used a thermos that keeps temperature pretty solid. Let's see, it's looking like 70, 79, 80. Oh, good. I'm using in Celsius, by the way. It's so hard. I'm trying to retrain myself. You'll see certain coffee recipes have a very prime temperature of anywhere between 90, but not boiling usually. It's usually like they let it boil and let it sit for 1 minute and then they use it. If you, let's switch to Fahrenheit. Yeah, perfect, 190. That's kind of the ideal temperature for coffee. So you can make a cup of coffee. You can maybe make 3 cups, 5 cups, but just change the temperature. See what it's like at boiling. See what it's like at 190. See what it's like at 180. See what it's like at 160, 170. So just, and you can change the temperature by adding cold water. And here's me struggling with the lid of this, like, come on, do it for the children. Oh boy. At any rate. You can also experiment with the method of pouring your coffee. So there's all this, you know, this procedure behind it, like you let it bloom. This, by the way, is the carbon dioxide that's trapped in there after fermentation, releasing, and you want that out because it can add a slightly sour taste to your coffee. At least that's the theory. So making a cup of coffee is really about extracting the compounds that you like, and there's a lot of oils, there's a lot of things that, and a lot of compounds that are very polar or partially polar, so you need hot water to get them out. Too hot, and you're going to get some of these more bitter compounds. Too cold, you're not going to get the more complex thing. Caffeine is pretty good. It's in the middle. It's a molecule with some OHs on there that can do hydrogen bonding. So I'm actually just following a recipe that I've been doing recently, where you let it bloom, and then you add your amount of water in 3 steps. You could do it continuous. You can do all sorts of things here. So one thing that might be fun is if you're making a cup of coffee, is you could see what it tastes. You could break it apart into different fractions. So like here, this is maybe the first minute or 30 seconds, and then hop it over to another cup, right? And then keep going, adding your water, right? So maybe you add, it could be like 50 milliliters of water for each one, or 100 mils or something like that. And then really just kind of, so you can see the progression of maybe what's going to be in here versus at the end. And this might be an interesting way to explore it. And then you can just taste it and see different things. You can play with the temperature, right? You can play with also the amount of time in here. And oftentimes the wisdom, you'll hear it in coffee circles. Nothing more than 3.5 minutes. But maybe you make you keep everything the same, the water, the amount of grinds, and you do like a 2 minutes, 3.5, 5 minutes, and then you test all 3. So that might be an interesting thing. I'm actually really interested in this experiment we're doing here. Let's do the next one. I'm not being very scientific, and I'm just kind of not keeping an eye on my clock. By the way, my balance has a clock on it because it's a coffee scale, okay? So these are some experiments to try with coffee. So try it out, see what you get. Let's see here. I'm kind of curious. Let's try this one. Whoa, that's really bitter. That's bitter. Interesting. So spread it out, see how it works. But really, it's such an interesting art. Whatever you do, though, just keep it consistent. Maybe watch some videos, see what you can find. Okay. All right.